Okay, hi everybody, and welcome back to the Film in Africa podcast. It's the podcast where we discuss African cinema and everything related to it. We've got one of the friends of the pod, one of the contributors to the pod, Ian Risdijk. Thanks for coming back.
Cool, thanks, Dylan.
Yeah. And today we're going to be talking about Touki Bouki, one of the greatest films like African cinema, one of my favorite films of all time. And I know you wanted to start with a quote by Mambéty.
Yeah, just to start with, I mean, this was the I think the first film I saw from like the sort of West, when I was getting into West African cinema, and I tracked on all these classic films on these old California newsreel VHS tapes that we had in the library, and I'd read about Sembe Usman, and then Touki Bouki was this one. I mean, it was like what do they call it? The Bonnie and Clyde of West African cinema, and it sounded, very, very interesting. And it was the most amazing experience because it's unlike any other film. It's got this particularly sort of amazing quality. It's even within Mambéty's own oeuvre, I think it's kind of stands alone, and it's now become a kind of landmark African film. And I think interesting also because Mambéty is such a sort of singular figure as well. It's not that he's not political, because he is, but his films look different to those that are being made by the other great African filmmakers of the time. And throughout his career, he resists categorization. He's not prolific. I think he only does 2 features and 3 or 4 short films and a documentary. There's a long gap between Touki Bouki and his next film, I think nearly 20 years. And it's as if he doesn't need to be. I think we get so used to the idea of directors being, once you're a director, that's your thing, that's what you do. And you maybe, particularly because we think about our auteurist directors in Hollywood and Europe, but he seemed as happy to be outside of cinema as in it for a long period of time until he returned, to make films after sort of 20 years. So I think he cuts this very interesting figure within African cinema. And also and what I think we're going to talk about today, the fact that his film and Touki Bouki itself is so, it's very much a product of imagination. And so the quote that I had in mind, I'm just going to read it here. He says, cinema is magic in the service of dreams. When a story ends or falls into the ocean, as we say, it creates dreams. I do the audience justice. They have the freedom to enter or not to enter my stories. They are free to take their own path, to enter or to leave. So I've always felt that, he makes that quote in response to a question about didactic cinema. Is there a lesson to be learned from the film? And if you read that interview, I mean, I think he mentions the word dreams like 25 times. I mean, it's a recurring theme. And so I think it's a great starting point to try and understand the film. And, you and I have had this experience teaching it. Is that sometimes it's wild and woolly and crazy, and then students start saying, yeah, but what does it mean? Like, what's going on? Yeah. And I think one of the nice entry points into it is through this idea of the dream. And as a result of that, like the critical discourse around it is often around the idea of Afro-surrealism as the one idea. And then the other one is this older notion, which I think has been kind of is argued against more now, the idea that it's a sort of African response to the French New Wave. That he's this experimentalist in the vein of Godard, Truffaut, Agnes Varda, and others. And it's hard to sort of say factually one way or the other. It's not like we know explicitly whether he watched those films or not. He doesn't talk about the French New Wave that much. But it was this. I think the problem with that idea was always that that his experimentalism needed to have some kind of origin. It couldn't be his alone. It had to have come from somewhere, and the link between obviously Senegal and West Africa and France was such that it was obvious perhaps that he had imbibed French film at some point. And I think more and more that seems to be, we can now say quite safely that it's it's a product of imagination, it's a product of dreaming, and so nowadays the work is more around this idea of Afro-surrealism and the kind of counterpoint to realism, which is what you see perhaps more in other filmmakers at the time.
Yes, yeah, totally. And also, like, like if you watch it, for me, it doesn't always feel like very French New Wave. You know what I mean? In the sense that there's so much going on that's so very particular to Dakar as a city and Senegal. There's also like the scene with the Tarzan
Yes.
guy, like that comes out of nowhere.
The wild white man.
Yeah. And there's and there's also kind of like there's a very like kind of West African or like African cinema concept of thinking about the margin and the center and what is the center. Like the characters, and he treats it in a very playful way. So the characters are always talking about they want to go to France, and they play that Josephine Baker, just a clip from that song.
Yeah, it drives you nuts after a while.
Paris, 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 c'est sur la terre un coin de paradis. Paris, Paris, Paris.
It's just I mean, it recurs all the way through the film to the point that you just want it to stop.
Yeah. So he's obviously like he's highlighting these things in a very like playful way, but like we're also saying that's even present in Atlantics, which is his niece's film. Even though like she didn't necessarily like study under him or try to reproduce anything he did. Like she's very much doing her own thing, but it's like at the same time that the idea of migration, the sea, all those things, and they're still relevant today. That's why I guess they're still.
And that's, I mean, you make a couple of good points there. That's the layering of it. He's born in Kolobane, which is a kind of poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Dakar. And in all of his films, there's a sequence where the character has to kind of traverse this wasteland between where people are picking through the rubbish between Kolobane and the urban center of Dakar. I mean, it's most humorously done in his film Le Franc, which is like, I think, scandalously underviewed. It's this fantastically droll comedy he makes in 1994 about a guy who wins the lottery, and his ticket is stuck on the back of his door of his shack, and he can't get it off, so he carries the whole door with him to Dakar to go and claim his winnings. And it's this kind of misadventure with this Chaplin-esque figure. But even there, this is one of the kind of heartbreaking but humorous scenes is this man with his door in his head making his way across the wasteland. And so all those, and you talk about the playfulness, and I think what's interesting about Mambéty is that, if you consider like some of the major themes for African filmmakers at the time, particularly, migration to Europe, the kind of the Fanonian issue of being displaced in Europe, of sort of not being at home anywhere, in a film like Le Noir de Sembène Ousmane, which is like a deeply tragic and serious film. Mambéty's approaching the same themes, in a way no less seriously, but there's a kind of comic quality to some of them as well. So the whole idea about the refrain of the Baker song, who herself was subject to kind of stereotypical offense in France and in America, is that this is the promise that's held out, but is in a way always interrupted. Like it's the refrain, it's never the whole song. And the idea of the white people on the boat at the end looking at Anta as sort of isolating her on the boat is something that Hondo picks up a little bit in Soleil in sort of 10 years earlier or 8 years earlier. And all the way through the film, there are these kind of moments where you can see how he's chipping away at that idea of, or reaffirming in these different layers, the sense of alienation these young people feel, Anta's frustrations at trying to study and not being able to study properly for university. And then also the way in which he reflects on the sort of urban realities of Dakar. And a few writers have made the point that as surreal as the film is at times, it's also grounded in a profound sense of the character's everyday struggle. So, when you see Anta walking from home to the university and she's going past people fighting for water in the queue, and you could take those scenes on their own and they would fit quite easily into a kind of realist representation of the post-colonial or kind of recently post-colonial African city. But when you kind of take a wider view of the film and you see those in relation to his kind of jumping backwards and forwards in time, as you say, the surrealist moments of the Tarzan figure, the wild man, there are scenes where they are the kind of wealthy couple in the car approaching, all those kinds of moments of clear kind of dreamlike fantasy. That's when you see the kind of tension between that and the realism that he's producing. Sembène Ousmane does something a little bit similar with Khala, but there it's more about allegory. It's like it's still grounded. We recognize it. The context in Mambéty, we often have no idea what he's going to do next in the film, in time or space. And I think it's that kind of sense of constant possibility. someone there's one writer who compares the idea of realism to surrealism, and I kind of think about it more as being about realism and possibility. Like there's always this something possible could happen in Mambéty's film that takes it away from the real, and you never know what that's going to be.
Yeah. Also, like this imagery that comes up that you can read in multiple ways. So there's that are slightly ambiguous, like the image of the horns themselves on the motorbike, and was famously used by Jay-Z and Beyonce when they did their tour. I think
and the music video. They did that music video.
Yes,
that's a famous scene, and I think it's such an iconic scene in African cinema because so much of what's happening in Africa at the time is about this debate around the rural and the urban. There's a strong sense that African cinema is predominantly urban in many ways, and what you see in that opening sequence is that long sort of shot of the little boy on the zebu, on the ox, and driving towards a camera, and it's very, very kind of, and you think, well, this is a realist kind of film. It's about maybe even a pre-colonial African environment, and then there's this kind of shocking, almost Eisensteinian rupture of the cow being slaughtered in the abattoir. And then there's this conversion. There's literally the kind of conversion of that animal capital into the mobility of the bike, which becomes a sort of, that's the mobility of the film. The reason why the film feels so kind of quick and zippy is because of, he's always Maureen Anta on the bike all the time.
Yeah.
And so that very, very simple, no dialogue, but that very, very simple and elegant transition of images that takes us from the rural, not just in terms of place, but also in terms of understanding a kind of modern capitalist economy in Africa. It's brilliant. And there's so many other films in Africa that will look at that, in the future or after that will look at these dynamics, and yet there's very few that approach the elegance of that sequence of shots. And it also allows them to kind of talk about the symbolism of the horns, similarly to the symbolism of the cross on the back of the bike. And that of course leads to that other famous scene of the sex scene on the cliff top overlooking the ocean, which is again a refrain. Every single one of his films has a scene at that location. This old French colonial fort overlooking the bay, and that's very taboo. There are very few scenes like that I can think of in African cinema for the next 20 years after that. And it's what he's being very taboo in terms of representing the not only the bodies of the two characters but the act itself at the time, but he's also it invigorates these young characters. It makes them dangerous, sort of both as characters but also as representations of something. And I think that's one of those really, really interesting moments in the film which stands out. And there are very, very few filmmakers who approach that sort of stylistic boldness, I think.
So true. I think Scorsese said it's like every frame just bursts on the screen, like with energy in Mambéty's films. But thinking about that symbolism of the cross and because in that scene she grabs onto the cross while they're making love, and is that like a Christian image? Is that image like?
No, I don't think it. I mean, I've forgotten right off the top of my head. I've forgotten the name of the. There's a particular name for that iron cross on the back of the bike. I think it's more the way in which they're represented. Once they're mobile, and there's the party scene. Because they're basically hustling for money, and the film becomes a kind of picaresque of sorts as they move through Dakar. Landing in all these different areas. Again, focusing on an explicitly gay character at the party, Charlie, and so to some extent, those scenes of them kind of together and apart. I think that scene on the cliff top is so important because it's the most intensely intimate that they are, and also sort of together in terms of common purpose. So that when we see them towards the end in this kind of frantic rush to kind of get to the boat. Even then, we're not quite sure what the outcome will be until we see that it's Anta's on the boat and Maury is kind of on the staircase, sort of left behind. And of course, what's fascinating about that, and I can't imagine Mambéty would have foreseen it then, but of course, 20 years later, he returns to that in this kind of beautiful allegory when he does Hyenas, which is based on a Swiss play by Dürrenmatt, The Visit. It's a fantastic play. And he uses the figure of the returning woman from Dürrenmatt to kind of be a ghost of Anta returning. So he adapts the play perfectly to this African context. This very wry commentary on the World Bank and sort of structuralism of sort of structured financial loans and everything. But it's basically the return of Anta all these years later to Senegal. And so that moment at the end of Touki Bouki, it's such an amazing foreshadowing of what he does. And I can't think of a filmmaker who's done that, or who's kind of produced this sort of ghostly 20-year sequel. It's amazing. And so I think in some ways, to get the best out of Touki Bouki, you kind of want to watch both films to see the return. But the later film is more patient. It's slower. It's where Touki Bouki is restless. It's got this mobility and energy to it that is fascinating. And I think the other thing, and we've talked about this before, is the way in which the film views the city, which I think is such an important part of a lot of those early films, where particularly in Sembène and Mambéty, where and Lefranc actually does it best, where the character is always looking up. It's always this kind of horizontal world where everything's kind of on the flat, and these characters are engaged in this kind of world of moving backwards and forwards from the shantytown to the urban center, going on these misadventures, and kind of always in the background or to the side are these kind of tall modern buildings which represents the kind of towers of modern capital, of transnationalism, kind of French colonialism. His characters never enter those buildings. They're always, if anything, looking up. And that world remains like they're almost moving through it all the time in Touki Bouki, but they're never going to enter it as such. And so I think in a lot of those films, it's interesting to see how the directors themselves are imagining the city. Whereas by comparison, most European films and American films are almost dominated by verticality in terms of urban films, about establishing shots. It's quite common to see an aerial shot or a view of a character in a building looking down. It's part of the grammar, in a way, of urban filmmaking, but you're not seeing it to that extent in Mambéty and in Sembène and others, but particularly in Touki Bouki, where these characters are roaming around, finding their way through the city.
Yeah, and even at the university, like specifically Maury, he's like an outsider. He gets teased by these kind of Marxist university students, intellectuals, and they tie him up.
Yeah, exactly. That scene.
So it's very much like a story of outside.
Very much, and I mean, but Mambéty says in his one interview that all of his films are about, it's a cinema of the outsider, because he says it's the outsider that actually provides the kind of new life for a community. He says outsiders are what are important to allow a community to change. And so he, in Lefranc, it's the comedian figure who is loved in some respects, but is also clearly on the outside, even within his own kind of world. When he moves to the city in Lefranc, there's this beautiful moment where he's playing an instrument, and it's a sort of petrol can guitar sort of thing, and then all of a sudden he just puts his hand inside and pulls out live birds just fly out of this guitar, and it's this amazing moment. You think, have they been in there all the time? Like, is it magic? Again, he's almost a magician. In Hyenas, it's, even though it's Ramatu who returns, the wealthiest woman in the world, she's the outsider. She's the person who's seeking her revenge, obviously in the film, but she's on the outside, and she's the one who's defining, in a way, the community and its transformation. So I think for him, it's often about these characters who are outsiders to the mainstream. And even the characters who Maureen and Anta visit, like Charlie's party. I mean, he's the center of the party, but he represents a kind of outsider figure in that society at the time as well. So it's very much, as you say, his characters are the outsiders in various different respects all the way through. And that's, I suppose, one of the reasons why so many, certainly American critics, saw it as being a kind of Bonnie and Clyde kind of gangster style, even though it's obviously not a gangster film, but it was about these kind of rebellious young figures, which is very much in keeping with American cinema in the late 60s and 70s, where everyone's in love with these kind of anti-hero outsider figures in like De Niro and Nicholson and Beatty and others, playing these kind of rebel characters. And Touki Bouki seems to kind of fit perfectly into that kind of mold as well.
I think that's also why it has such lasting relevance, is that it can be read within different frameworks, and it has this kind of transnational really like this transnational understanding and influence. It's kind of like an outsized influence,
and it's got a pop culture quality. I mean, the fact that your citing of, I'd forgotten about the Jay-Z Beyonce thing, but that's it's very much part of. And I was thinking the other day about the kind of current strand of sort of I don't know what the word is really, but it's kind of like sort of Pan-Africanism that's breaking out with all these films by like James Samuel and Ryan Coogler and others, and this sort of focus on this kind of Pan-African cultural ideal. Like Touki Bouki's in that. Like it's you find it popping up in odd places all the time. Either references to the Zebu horns or to the bike scene or to Maureen Hunter's characters. Like it's very much to me a kind of cultural. It's like very culturally relevant still, and that's one of the reasons why it's still so frequently watched. And it remains very, very different. It remains a film that even set against contemporary African sort of action style films, Touki Bouki is still, unique. And I think, there's always been an idea of how Sembène Ousmane and Sarah Maldarour and Hondo are so fundamental to that kind of first wave, I suppose, of African sort of post-liberation filmmakers. And Mambéty always is included in that, but he's always kind of slightly to the side because they don't quite know where to put him, and yet he's like, as you say earlier, whether it's his niece's film Atlantics, he's deeply influential in what filmmakers do after that.
So thank you so much.
Cool.
This has been really great, and thank you to everybody for watching this podcast. Thanks for supporting Film in Africa. There's also a Mambéty quote I just remembered where he says, "It's good for the future of cinema that Africa exists." And I think it really ties up really nicely everything we've been speaking about today, and also like the idea of being the outsider and the outsiders being the ones that actually move society forward, as opposed to stagnating society or not inventing anything. But we've got to end it there, but please stay tuned. And stay tuned for the next installment.
Cool. Thanks, Dylan.
Great.
Great.